These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Movement and Memory, Reflections on Labor and the Genealogy of Resistance with Saladin Muhammad. Africa World Now Project is next. Abdul Alkalimat writes on a multimedia project that explores the work of Saladin Muhammad that our movements for social transformation have often fallen victim to the tendency to oversimplify the struggle. Moreover, there is far too little self-criticism to learn from our right and left errors. This is particularly dangerous as we are at the beginning of a new generational awakening. We need to think about the past few decades of struggle by listening to those who have marched on and maintained a revolutionary perspective. Labor, whether forced or extracted through coercion, has been a consistent cause of struggle for Africana peoples globally. James Boggs, in a speech given at a political science seminar at Atlanta University on February 17, 1974, argued that we must be ready to recognize that as reality changes, our ideas have to change so that we can project new, more advanced aspirations worth striving for. This is the only way to avoid becoming prisoners of ideas which were once progressive but have become reactionary, i.e., have been turned into their opposite. The only struggles worth pursuing are those which advance the whole society and enable all human beings to evolve to a new and higher stage of their human potential. Expanding this assertion, Boggs goes on to suggest that knowledge must move from perception to conception. In other words, knowledge and struggle begin by perceiving our own reality, but it must have the aim of developing beyond what you, yourself, or your own group can perceive, to wider conceptions that are based upon the experiences of the whole history of mankind. The only way that anyone can take this big step of moving beyond perception to conception is by recognizing and struggling against your own internal contradictions and weaknesses. Of these weaknesses, the most fundamental and most difficult to overcome as a result of the specific history of United States society, and I will add the evolution of the global racial capitalist system, is the tendency not to think at all, but simply to react in terms of individual or ethnic self-interest. Saladin Muhammad is an exemplar of what a movement can produce. He is the representation of the long genealogy of Africana struggle moving within and around the various institutional formations that were and are rooted in resisting the redefinition of the human as a justification for and maintenance of private property. Reflecting more on the praxis of Saladin Muhammad, Abdul Alkalimat asserts that there are many theoretical and practical issues involved in the experiences covered by the life of Saladin Muhammad and his experiences in struggle. Saladin is a proletarian cadre of the revolutionary movement. He did not graduate from high school but got his education in the movement. He considers himself a communist of the African American nation fighting to end capitalist rule in the United States. He thinks global and fights local. He served as a chairperson of the Black Workers for Justice for over 20 years. While being retired from full-time union organizing, he remains active on many battlefronts, including the Southern Workers' Assembly. Today, we will air part 1 of our recent conversation with Baba Saladin Muhammad. Saladin Muhammad is an organizer, theoretician, writer, who has published a number of articles that explore issues ranging from exposing the structural and systemic racism in labor to ways to understand the interdependence of human rights and Black internationalism. Saladin Muhammad is the co-founder and national chair of Black Workers for Justice, and until his retirement, he was an international representative of the United Electrical Workers Union. His praxis has been forged in Black freedom work for more than 3 decades. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think deeply, act accordingly. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Baba Saladin Muhammad. How are you?
I'm doing okay, thanks.
Good. We have a wide audience and a very large audience. And once we get into the conversation, I'm sure you'll be familiar with, you will be familiar to a lot of the people who listen to this particular program. But for the benefit of those who are being introduced to you at this particular moment in this particular conversation, could you just give us a little bit of a short bio, or short as long as you want, of who Baba Saladin Muhammad is?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My mother is from the Rocky Mountain, North Carolina area. Is how I really got to North Carolina. I guess I've been active, pretty active, consciously active since '65. Actually, I was not so proud of admitting I was in the military, and I was in Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo, and I pretty much got politicized there. Woke up exposed to contradictions of U.S. society, colonization, imperialist aggression in a country, where Black people were very, very significant, a majority, in fact. And I got out of the military in '66, got married in '66, and went to work for Philco Ford, making television for about almost 7 years in a big plant in Philadelphia. Became pretty active in the Black liberation movement. That shaped my thinking about U.S. society and about the world. In fact, number of activities in Philadelphia that were pretty noted activities that I participated in. Initially, I wasn't. I was in a trade union, but I wasn't a trade unionist at that time. I was a Black liberation activist. But probably around 1970, around 74, 75, began to be more associated with the labor movement, and we formed the organization called the Black Workers Support Committee in around 1975. Earlier, I had been a part of a section of the Revolutionary Action Movement called the Black Guards, and that really molded my political and ideological thinking. And after a series of activities in the organization called the African People's Party, which was an outgrowth of the Revolutionary Action Movement, found myself connected to national frameworks. I attended the 1967 Black Power Conference in Newark, New Jersey, and the '68 Black Power Conference in Philadelphia. Was involved in both of them, mainly as a young activist, learning and meeting people, and coming back, to local work having a bigger picture of what the local work, was connected to. Um, then in the 70, this was 72, 71, maybe 71 or 72, was a part of the first mobilization of the African Liberation Day coalition movement. At that time, probably did meet, but still young, listening, a meeting with Walter Rodney and a few others. Again, listening. I'm not even sure whether I asked the question at that meeting or not, but he was talking to us about the Sixth Pan-African Congress that was scheduled to be held, and what we might expect. And it was very, very good to hear him. He was grounded. His terms, were not unreachable, and so I felt, generally pretty comfortable. At that meeting was a brother named Owusu Sadaki, Nelson Johnson, who's from Greensboro, Max Stanford, Muhammad Ahmed, brother named Jalali. I think that was probably about it.
Yeah, interestingly enough, you actually gave so many points of entry, so many points that we can actually, go off in this conversation. And I want to try to go down a number of these paths that you just laid out. I must make sure that everyone understands that this was a very brief, recollection on your part of the many types of formations that you were involved with. You mentioned RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, and you mentioned Muhammad Ahmed, but I want to back up for a second, and I want to talk about the transition from one particular point, particularly with your name, from one particular point in your life, and having a name that was given to you by your family, by your mother, but then moving into Saladin Muhammad. Because the reason why I think that is important to really talk about that is because we know that that evolutionary period also developed in the context of a consciousness, a critical consciousness level raising, a critical consciousness in the context of raising, because we could talk about, Malcolm Little to Malcolm X to Malik El Haj Shabazz, right? So then what is it that propelled you, or how did your transition and from literally you self-naming, or you being able to identify yourself and then articulate that not only with your actions and your theoretical and intellectual formations, but also in the context of you being able to name yourself?
Well, around 65, 66, our kind of ideological leader was Malcolm X. And many of us followed Malcolm culturally, politically, and some religiously. I uh, I took what's called Shahada, Kalima Shahada, which is many would be associate that with being baptized. Um, I think my Kalima was in 1970, but um, I became Saladin around that time, even though politically I started following uh, the teachers of Malcolm and also was being mentored by Muhammad Ahmed, Max Stanford, as early as 67. Uh, it's really kind of interesting. I was in better shape than I am now. I was a martial artist, started training in 67, but probably, hand-to-hand combat in the military as early as 63, you know. So, but the Asian martial arts in '67, and Max Stanford, he came to the dojo, and many of the young people were training that were part of the Black Guards, and he handed me a whole stack of Black Guard manuals and said, "Organize the guard," you know, and I did, you know, organize a unit of the Black Guards, and you know, became pretty active. Helped to organize a uh, a student demonstration, high school student demonstration. Of course, I was out of high school, you know, but this was the November 17th, 1967, a march on the Board of Education, and it was a massive march, probably between 7 and 10,000 students. Uh, Rizzo was the police commissioner. Frank Rizzo was the police commissioner at that time, and he, you know, let the police loose. And we were young and training, and a lot of us young people saw this as an opportunity to test our training, you know, uh, and you know, some of us got arrested, and that kind of thing. That was uh, then this had occurred, I think, right after the '67 Black Power Conference in Newark. So it was one of the early kind of uprisings, you know, students in high school and some junior high school that occurred, and we started to see other such uprisings develop across the country. You know, '68, those. You know, so I my awakening in 1967 was also the Detroit Rebellion, and elements of RAM were in Detroit at that time. So my awakening was during a period of rebellion, Black rebellion. So my understanding of what being a revolutionary was or meant was largely shaped by that. Robert Williams was also, by way of RAM, a part of what was shaping our thinking, and it pretty early on, even though at that time we were developing as nationalists and pretty much revolutionary nationalists. Rob's relationship to RAM and Malcolm's experience began to shape a kind of internationalism for me and others, you know, that was relating to.
Before we get into that development of a clear internationalist perspective, I wanted to back up just a few steps here, because I wrote down in my notes here, of course, Robert F. Williams, particularly when you mentioned the notion of being radicalized or seeing firsthand U.S. imperialism by way of the military service that you had. And I'm also thinking about other folk here, such as Jack Odell. Um, and one of the things that I'm also seeing here is this common denominator in the middle of all of this is a certain level of activism, being exposed to the contradictions in a capitalist system, and also how it constructs society, and the question of labor. And of course, this leads you to, when you mentioned this in your brief outline earlier, that you was involved or organizing before trade unionism. And I know that a lot of work that you have done is to really kind of expose a number of the contradictions of racism and unionism in the context of the activism that Black workers have been engaged in, consistently. Could you talk a little bit about before, because I definitely want to get to the internationalism, because you mentioned, of course, Muhammad Ahmed, you mentioned, Robert F. Williams. Could you talk a little bit about that in the center of this, you know, the question of labor? What was that question as you were developing that in your activism as a young person? And as you start to move forward, at the center of your life's work is really to expose those contradictions that we find in labor movements and its entry into unionism. Could you talk a little bit about the ideas there that Robert F. Williams and other people kind of, helped you kind of solidify as you're moving forward? And of course, Muhammad Ahmed with RAM, institutionalizing you guys, institutionalizing and capturing the energy of you young folk who are really rebelling against a nation state and the way that it treats people, not only here in the United States, but also across the world.
Well, I was in the I was in a trade union when I worked at Philco Ford. Uh, I would occasionally attend trade union meetings, but wasn't really a trade union activist. I do remember one experience, which kind of it was an enlightening experience. It took me a little time to really understand it. This supervisor, I worked on a line where the chassis of the televisions were were put together, and this supervisor, white guy, really wasn't much older than myself. I used to wear dashiki to work, and I was a drummer, kunga drummer at that time. So I would bring my drum to work in a duffel bag and had to leave it downstairs with the guards. But I had my dashiki on, and as I would, come to work, and again, young and uh, uh, you know, remembering, the quotes from Malcolm and others, you know, uh, this Ray guy's name was Ray Golly. He was the supervisor. He would stand next to my position where I was working at, and he would make all kinds of, kind of comments, you know, uh, to somebody else, or just loud enough for me to hear, you know. He said something about Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael at that time, before Kwame Ture, before that name changed, and I would sit there and, you know, uh, I remember one time missing my task on the chassis, and it was on the assembly line, so it just went by me because this guy, you know, I was, listening to him and, thrown off by him. Then he chewed me out. You understand? What are you doing? You're supposed to be working. You're not getting paid for nothing. That kind of thing. Like setting me up. And one time he kind of did this, and I rose up. You understand? I challenged him. You know, and I got suspended. Uh, and I know I came back to work a week later, a week suspension, and he tried to do it again. I rose up, and this white woman, old white woman, she was clearly one of the Slavic countries. You can hear the draw in her, and I'm talking about she probably was I don't know if she was 5 feet tall. She could have been 5'1" or 5'4", 11". She was a steward, and she came over and says, what do you think you're doing, Golly? Call him Golly, Ray Golly. What do you think you're doing, Golly? Leave that work alone. You know, you go and you supervise, he work, and backed him up. You understand? Damn, to myself, And she says, you all right, son? That kind of thing. Yeah. I said, yeah, all right, I'm all right, thanks. Now my father, he was in the trade union. He worked at the Philadelphia Navy Yard for about 35 years, you know. But he was a hard worker, and paid his dues, and he had good things to say about the union, but he was a union member. He wasn't necessarily an activist per se. So I saw this, and so I started going to union meetings, after that experience, and more listening and learning. Still not yet an activist or leader, but became pro-union, in that experience. I later on saw that there was a contradiction between the workers and the bosses, and that at least in my experience and experiences after that, some workers were not going to let the boss get away with, shop stewards were not going to let the boss get away with just exercising, this kind of power, this domination over workers. It was like, whether I like that boy or not, he's a part of the union, and we're gonna fight you. We're gonna challenge you on that. That was my generally experience. Inside. Now you had there was a difference between the upper crust of the bureaucracy and many of the stewards that were on the floor, because they were workers on the floor. And sometimes it's hard to see these distinctions. It was hard to see these distinctions because there was collaboration during my period, and you find them in some instances today. Stewards, no matter how long they worked there, they had what was called super seniority, which meant that during periods of layoffs, they, even though they had less time than other workers who were getting laid off, they didn't get laid off because they had super seniority, and you had some workers who became stewards, for that reason. During my time, I can't remember any black shop stewards at that time, So this was 66 to around 71, maybe early 72, 71 probably, yeah. In 70, when I got laid off, started working a few different places. I had a family. I just had our first son was born in late 66. So I still had to work, but I at that time I had access to what they call a GI loan. And the GI loan would cover you going to school. Well, I hadn't graduated from high school when I went in the Army. So I did use the GI loan to go to school for a GED, and that was enough to provide some contribution for my family. I don't know whether I'm getting to
No. Actually, what's going on here is that you've done so much that things are running together at this particular point. This is a very important period here too, because what I'm seeing as well, because one of the things that I think is important that I want to kind of tease out in your response just now is that at the same time that this is going on. You are listening to a recent conversation I had with Saladin Muhammad. Saladin Muhammad is an organizer, theoretician, writer who has published a number of articles, pamphlets, and papers that explore issues ranging from labor to race to human rights and Black internationalism. Saladin Muhammad is co-founder and national chair of Black Workers for Justice, and until his retirement, he was an international representative for the United Electrical Workers Union, the UEW. His praxis has been forged in Black freedom work for more than 3 decades. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities of Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson, and Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Continue to enjoy the program. At the same time that this is going on, and you mentioned becoming consciously active, in this 60 and 65 period, but you also, again, your consciousness and your intellectual formations are being developed as well. For those of us who understand the idea that an intellectual is not somebody that just has letters behind their name, because I'm definitely one of those particular people, this is an important period and you developing, because you're going to work with dashikis and leaving your conga drum down at the security desk, right? So I think that that's important as well. So there's a level of consciousness development that you're engaged in, specifically through your work with the revolutionary action movement. Am I correct in kind of assessing that particular period? Because you guys are not only organizing, right, but you're also engaged in political education.
I mean, again, the African People's Party, was outgrowth, and I became very, very active. But see, in 66, 67, many of us were a part of study groups or, liberation schools. And this was also during the early period of the fight for Black studies, Black history in the school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So some of us, people who were a part of the African People's Party, the outgrowth of RAM, were in study groups with people who had begun to be teachers in some universities very early on, in the universities. So we were receiving, I don't know whether one would say courses or what, but we were studying pamphlets, books. Some of us learned public speaking, how to put a leaflet together that we pass out, those things. And so that's where my education really came from. Malcolm said, travel broadens the scope, you know. And so, I met people like James Boggs, Jimmy, we called him, and Grace. This was in the 60s. These were people who Muhammad Ahmed, Max Stanford was very close to, and by way of him, being with him, I met them. Activists who were part of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers out of Detroit, and so it was interaction with these forces. Many of us working in the plant, studying Marxism, studying history, and for a number of us, our ideas that came from our engagement in the movement, and that was how we grew. I remember I I probably told this story one or two times. I had written a paper or something that was on the National Independent Black Political Party, NBIP, and there was a meeting in Michigan. I don't know if it's Lansing. It was one of the universities there, and a number of us was there. And Manning Marble was there, and I really didn't know Manning, and I may have heard of his name, etc. But there was a table where people who had papers, they would just lay them down, you know. So I'm across the room, and I heard somebody says, "Who is Saladin Muhammad?" That was Manning. He had picked it, was reading, you know. And the first thing he asked me, he said, "What school did you go to, brother?" I said, "What school? What do you mean?" He said, "Well, yeah, I'm reading your paper." I said, "Well, I guess the movement was the school that I went to." And you know, I remember that story, that experience, because again, you know, there's always some assumption about where people learn at, where they get their information from, and what's legitimate and what's not legitimate information. And you know, when I said that, he smiled. He didn't say anything else. You know, but you know, you wonder sometimes whether you know, whether there's, you know, whether one continues to be impressed or, you know, or not, you know, after, you know, they asked that question from the very, very beginning, you know. But there's a lot of us, uh, you know, with this kind of experience that we've had to really learn, and particularly, you know, those of us who didn't have the opportunity, or that wasn't necessarily part of our past, you know, to go to school. I wish I wouldn't be able to go to school, you know, but don't have. I got children who carried that part out for me, you know. But a lot of young people, uh, 66, 67, probably up to maybe even up to around 70, 73 or so, was shaped by the movement, you know, and you know that having a sense of history helps us to see, you know, that they're the term organic intellectuals, or you know, those kinds of things. So you know, in my experience.
And that experience is a very important experience to not only document but also to kind of use as a framework or a tool of analysis to understanding where we're at today, particularly in the context of whether it's Black studies or institutionalized knowledge development, but also its access. So what you know, obviously what is important here is in this particular period, the question around access also revolved around questions of power, right? You know, so you guys are developing a framework. You're having conversations and thinking with James and Grace Lee Boggs and you know the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Talk a little bit more about the notion of ideas that you guys were developing was also very, very integral to shaping your experiences or engagement with what you call the, you know, what you term to be the movement.
You know, probably. I mean, there was a couple of levels. Uh, Probably the 66, 67, up through the around the 1970 levels. My work was mainly local work. You know, you get exposed nationally. I attended the 1969 Black Economic Development Conference in Detroit. This is when Jim Foreman, uh, one of the leaders of SNCC, James Foreman, um, made the call for reparations. Him and Lucius Walker from IFCO and those elements. But I was bringing back these experiences to local work, to the a group that we had formed initially called the Young Afro-Americans in '66, and we changed the name to the Young African Nation. And this was beginning to develop an understanding of African Americans in the U.S. and particularly in the South as being an oppressed nation, you know. And so we changed from Young Afro Americans to Young African Nation. And so my travels and participation, again, more learning as opposed to uh, playing any significant role, in the Black Power conferences and the Black Economic Development Conference, and begin to bring this thinking back to a community in North Philly that I grew up in, projects called the Richard Allen Projects in North Philly, uh, and and there was a small cadre. We had organized a center, had a Freedom Center right next to the projects, and was able to. I remember in '69 we brought Sun Ra on our block, and people was like, wow, Sun Ra was not only he had some kind of some kind of gadget that he had his piano and stuff on that it just spinned around like a merry-go-round, and had the other instrumentalists, looking like angels with wings and everything, Now this was right at the projects. I mean, people just couldn't believe it, you know, couldn't couldn't believe it, It's like, well, what, how did this happen? What, where did the resources come from? Wasn't no Sunrise, we was able to get him to come. It wasn't, no cost or anything, but it was like being exposed to things, because of travel and relationships that you build, or you were able to enter into. It brought, some thinking that just, being, in the projects where we grew up at, wouldn't have happened all by itself, and at that time, I didn't see, I mean, I saw this is something that freedom fighters did, confidence that some of the young people and some of the parents, I was a parent, but I mean, I'm talking about older than I was, begin to have things that they're able to talk about, uh, start to see the relationship between the local and the national, and how important it is, to developing a worldview or developing a national, those kinds of things. And a few things happened. We were young, around 1970. The drugs had been brought into the community. Clearly, became evident by the state. It was. I mean, this was a place that I and others had grew up in and seen some good times. My mother was kind of active person. They call her the hot dog lady. They used to have talent shows at the playground, and my mother would make hot dogs, and people would sing and perform, and she was active person. And so when you start to see, the decay and the infighting, among people who was in the same community, et cetera, it was really hurtful for some of us. And so in 1970, we had started agitating against the drug pushers, went out and this and that. And Yeah, I remember there was some Democratic ward leader, and it was some kind of, he had been a ward leader for 38 years, and people wanted to get him out, and I remember we went through the community with bullhorns, talk about get him out, and right there, the dope pushers was around there, and uh, turned the bullhorn down with the politicians and the pushers too. Turned it right into that, and the pushers too, and I said, it was at night, and I remember saying, how many people want these drugs out of the community? You know, turn your lights off. The lights in people's houses, apartments start going off. You know, and boy, that did something to us. You understand, to see this expression of real support. You understand, and being tired. And right then we tried to build a united front. Representatives of the Black Panther Party, Philly Black Panther Party, representatives of the Republic of New Africa, and representatives. They were Simbas. They were connected to Karinga, Ryan Karinga. In Philly, there was a group that was a chapter or something of them. So we met at this Freedom Center, they called it the Black House that we had, and we had decided that we were going to we were going to go to this area, and we want to wage a struggle. When that day came, we waiting. It was only a small unit of the Black Guards, the Black Panther Party. Their representatives was at the location selling papers, free Bobby, because Bobby Seale was in jail. Free Bobby, they and the guy from the Simbas, they didn't show up, and a couple people from the Republic, they didn't show up at all. So it was just essentially us from the Young African Nation. That was the new wing of the Black Guards that we had formed, and went out, and things happened. We were young. We were young. We walked just a couple blocks down to the projects from what you call, and we were we were equipped. As we went through, and had the bullhorn. Didn't have didn't have an exit strategy. Didn't have nothing at all. Just we 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 went, and dashikis and instruments under the dashikis, and everything. And before we got there, this young brother, he was about he was probably about 13 or something. He came up with a bike. He says, "Look," he says, somebody's waiting up in a 4-story building with a rifle, was waiting for us." So came around and, said, "Aim up at the 4-story building." Either looked like the window closed or something, and the person like disappeared, this and that, and then all hell kind of broke out. And I remember, at least I'm reminded of constantly, as we were running, this older sister says, "Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on." Told me and this other brother to come up into her apartment. She saved us, actually. She saved us from either being arrested or being killed at that time. You know, and uh, uh, but it's, you build relationships with people, and these kinds of things. and they show themselves later on in some critical moments. Show themselves, and I remember us running back up towards the Black House. And this brother who was a postal worker named Bubby, I never forget it. I think he's transitioned on. He had a Volkswagen, and he says, "This is the best I can do," you know. And me and this other brother who was had just left out of this lady's house, and a couple of other brothers who had scattered and came back to the Black House. It seemed like about 7 of us got into 7 to 8 of us got to the Volkswagen, little Volkswagen, and he drove us away. Again, Bubby, he was a good cat, worked who wasn't involved, but it was a moment, you understand, that he felt that he could do something, and we got away. And the first time I wrote something, aside from a leaflet or some notes or something, uh, myself and my wife, we had 2 children then, son and a daughter, who was 2 and 4. We had to leave, and we were in a location that had a potbelly stove, literally up in the mountains, up in Colorado somewhere. And I wrote something called "The Making of a Black Revolutionary." And this was before James Forman wrote "Making of a Black Revolutionary." I wrote this in 1970. Handwritten, me and my partner. Really interesting. It probably was about 20 pages or something, handwritten pages or something. And you find your way back, traveling around and searching for people, this and that. But I mean, that was an experience, an exile experience. I was relatively young. I guess I was probably around 25 or something, 24, 25, 1970. And these friends, middle class forces, real progressive element. They got us out, got a plane, this and that, and we was gone. Didn't know where we was going at, and wound up in Denver. And then they took us to a mountain location, and interesting, very, very, very interesting location. And I mean, at that time, you have an experience of having to flee, you understand, and then to gain an appreciation of a network of contacts that I didn't create. You know, uh, I was connected to by virtue of my connections. With RAM, and the African People's Party and that kind of thing. So you start to really have an appreciation of being part of a movement. That you're able to get out. And that kind of thing. Because you know the um, so again, you come back. I come right back into the same area. And I remember coming right back, and people looked at me like, people from the neighborhoods, like their eyes was popped out, like, what are you doing? That kind of thing. You came back and was welcome back, but you see people want change, but even though they were they were fearful. And so again, you gain an appreciation for what being in a movement, what a network is, what an infrastructure to be able to, of a movement is. And once you, you you sit down or you're forced to sit down to think about those kind of things, and my children, oh boy, they know the names of people, unlike today, where every conference, you understand, the hotels are filled up or this and that. We would go to meetings, we sleep on each other on the floor or somebody's couch, or they had a bedroom, etc. And the first time I slept in a hotel to be at a conference was the 1972 National Black Political Assembly in Gary, Indiana. And it was probably 8 or 10 of us was in one of the hotel rooms by himself, So, but today, everybody got to have a hotel room, and that kind of thing. And the children, people say, "Oh, that's Muhammad Ahmed. That's so." Children know him, because those that kind of contact. The movement wasn't a distance from our homes. So I mean, I got it kind of molding and shaping.
No, Baba, I definitely wanted to chime in here because that's you're talking about that space in between spaces that we talk about. So the space of creating or institutionalizing a movement. That's it for Africa Woke Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africawokenowproject@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram @Africa Woke Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa Woke Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muiza Muntali, Africa Woke Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research, content contributor, and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Orderson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa Woke Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa Woke Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.